I recently caught up with Dr. Marko Spasojevic, who has an early view paper in Journal of Ecology on exploring community assembly processes from functional diversity patterns.
My name is Marko Spasojevic. I'm currently a postdoc in Susan Harrison's lab at University of California, Davis, where I'm working on a variety of projects, including exploring functional diversity patterns on serpentine and non-serpentine soils, and project assessing the potential for cooler microhabitats to act as refugia for species in the face of climate change. I did my PhD with Catherine Suding at University of California, Irvine. The focus of my PhD was exploring functional diversity patterns in alpine tundra. And I received my undergraduate degree from the University of Washington in Seattle.
So you published a paper recently with your PhD advisor in the Journal of Ecology, and so I'll just let you describe it. What was the main problem you were trying to solve, or what motivated the study?
So this project really started with me wanting to understand how the factors that structure communities change along environmental gradients. Alpine tundra is sort of really interesting in that you get really strong environmental gradients over really short distances. Like 10 meters, you can have huge changes in productivity, species composition. So I really started with wanting to understand those. And when I initially jumped into the literature, there were sort of these two competing hypotheses of how the factors that structure communities change along gradients. The main one being a shift from abiotic structuring to competition as you move from the stressful end to the more resource-rich end, and the other being a shift from below-ground competition to above-ground competition. And at the time, these were sort of presented as mutually exclusive, but we sort of thought that using functional traits would be a good way to integrate those and allow us to assess these multiple processes at once. And so our second motivation was sort of that these classic interpretations of functional diversity really just focused on sort of abiotic structuring and competition, and really don't mention facilitation. And we know that's pretty important in the alpine, so we wanted to try to figure out a way to incorporate facilitation into exploring patterns of functional diversity.
Right. If you could boil down your findings from the paper to a couple of main bullet points, what would they be?
I guess our two main findings is one that sort of multiple assembly processes structure alpine plant communities along a stress resource gradient. At our sort of more harsh environment, it's abiotic structuring for wind and cold and below ground competition. And as we move to the more benign habitat, it's a shift toward above ground competition for light. And our second main finding is that if you looked at just phylogenetic diversity or a multivariate functional diversity index, you wouldn't see all these patterns, and that looking at individual traits really gives us a more complete picture of the assembly mechanisms operating.
How general do you think these results are? Do you expect them to see the same patterns in different habitats, or similar habitats in different latitudes, or different patterns?
I think they're relatively general, and I think in some ways, I think our results that multiple assembly processes are operating simultaneously is probably relatively general, and it's probably happening in a lot of systems. So anything where there's a strong abiotic component, like semi-arid grasslands, there's probably filtering for water availability, but also some competition going on. So the idea that both these are operating is probably pretty widespread. As far as finding the same patterns we found, I think probably in a lot of tundra habitats we'd see something similar, but as we move into a more benign environment, you probably see less of the abiotic structuring and more of a importance of competition.
Right. In the discussion, you recommended picking traits carefully, and so it made me think of a potential trade-off where if you pick traits carefully, then you run the risk of potentially biasing your results. But then again, if you do a fishing expedition, as they say, and just measure everything you can, that doesn't seem ideal either. So, what are your thoughts on picking traits?
I definitely think it's important to pick traits traits carefully. I guess there is the potential to be too careful. I think really the critical thing to think about is picking multiple traits associated with multiple different processes or different resources.
Right.
I've seen some studies where out of 11 traits measured, 8 of them were associated with one process. Then, of course, they find evidence for that process.
Right.
And so sort of balancing your traits between different processes is probably where you want to be careful. I think it allows, like, if you really don't know the system that well, you can pick a whole suite of different assembly mechanisms or resources and a few traits associated with each one of those that can give you, some indication of what's going on.
There's a whole suite of papers coming out now on this phylogenetic community structure stuff. So is all that literature to just be taken with a grain of salt, or?
No. I think like the phylogenetic patterns are still really important, and I think what's useful about them is they sort of integrate over all the traits you measure and all the traits you don't measure, and they really give sort of like the net effect, so the dominant mechanisms operating. I think the important thing to consider with looking at phylogenetic diversity and multivariate functional diversity is if you have sort of opposing assembly processes, like competition should select for more phylogenetic diversity, whereas abiotic filtering should select for low phylogenetic diversity. Right. So if you have both of those operating, they're going to sort of balance each other out, and you end up somewhere in the middle. And so there may mask sort of the patterns that way, of the individual processes that may be operating. So I think it's still really informative, but I think it's probably most informative if you use it in conjunction with trait analyses.
Right. So do you think the utility of the phylogenetic structure approach depends on scale? Because in your study, it was a relatively small scale compared to some of the other studies like this that are out there in the literature. So it makes me wonder if phylogenetic approach would be more applicable at a very large scale.
Yeah, I think probably if you're getting a lot, like huge turnover going from a grassland to a forest, it's probably much more applicable than where you have a lot of similar forbs that are varying slightly in traits.
So, and what about extending the results to highly invaded habitats? I mean, I imagine your study sites were relatively pristine.
The alpine tundra has almost no invasive species.
So do you think invasive species would sort of somehow buck these trends in some ways?
I think there's a potential for that. We've started looking at that with Susan Harrison. We're doing a lot of work in California grasslands, and in some of our data sets, we have about 60% of the species are invasive, and it's really sort of swamping the functional diversity patterns. So I think it may really alter what we see on the ground, and so we've started separating out the invasives when we analyze functional diversity, doing it both with and without, and seeing very different patterns.
I wonder if there's been any research on this, so sort of the variation among individuals within species in the functional trait literature.
There's actually a lot of the literature is starting to push toward integrating interest-specific variability into the functional trait data. I think it's sort of one of the big things missing right now. I think as more and more of these large trait databases are developed for people just to pull data, there's sort of the potential for results that aren't really showing what's on the ground because they're not taking into account sort of variation and plasticity within these traits. And I think it's going to be a really important topic for functional diversity here soon. Right.
That was the research published in the paper was your PhD research. Do you plan to go back and do any research there on that question or that system?
I would like to get back to working in the alpine tundra at some point in my career. Right now I've sort of shifted into still staying in mountain environments, but I've been doing a lot of my work in the Siskiyou Mountains in Oregon. It's a slightly different system, not quite as environmentally harsh, but still pretty interesting. There's a lot more gradients there. And so I've been collaborating with Ellen Damshin and Jim Grace to look at Whitaker's old sampling plots and look at functional diversity patterns there. And there we have gradients of soil moisture, elevation, soil fertility with multiple different soil types, tree density. So there we're going to try to look at how all these different factors both directly and indirectly influence functional diversity. But I would still like to get back to the alpine tundra and do some more mechanistic experiments there.
What was the most challenging part of the study?
Surprisingly, it was actually the functional diversity analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started this project, there wasn't a really strong consensus on what metric to use.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually reanalyzed this data set multiple times as new, better functional diversity metrics came out.
Mm-hmm.
And so it took a long time to actually finish this just because of all the new, different advances in functional diversity metrics.
Right.
The field work in the Alpine is great, and it's basically going hiking up in the mountains every day, and can't really complain there.
Right. To wrap it all up, what do you think are the consequences for the field of your paper?
Well, I hope it sort of gets people to consider looking at individual trait patterns a little more. Mm-hmm. And, if, like I said, functional diversity and multivariate functional diversity, phylogenetic diversity and the multivariate functional diversity indices are important. They can, potentially mask some of the patterns that may be going on. Mm-hmm. So I really hope that it sort of gets people to really consider looking at individual trait patterns and how there may be multiple assembly mechanisms operating.
Right.